Evening, everyone. Welcome to Tamaquag's series, Literature and Culture Author Conversations. Through this series, we hope to engage the audience through chat dialogue, strategic questions, and learning through literature regarding culture, history, indigeneity, and the complexities of life. Thank you for joining us today for this virtual discussion made possible in thanks to funding by the Rhode Island Council on the Arts, the Rhode Island Council for the Humanities, the New England Foundation for the Arts, USDA Rural Development, and people like you. You too can support programs like this by making a tax-deductible donation to the Tamaquag Museum. The link is in the chat box. Just a quick reminder before we get started, please make sure that you are all on mute. Please engage with us by using the chat box to type in your questions, and we'll add them into the conversation. We will have time to take additional live questions and comments at the end of the author conversation. There are also going to be opportunities where we're going to show a couple of pictures tonight. If you want to pin the square for the, actually you don't need to do that. I just remembered it's going to show, so don't worry about that. But if you want to pin the speaker, Patricia Rubertone, you can pin her. If you don't know how to do that, there's 3 little dots next to your image, top right corner. And if you click it, it says pin, and that would make the speaker stand out to you if you're having trouble in the kaleidoscope of pictures. Also, you can use your reaction buttons to show your enthusiasm, clapping for people or thumbs up or hearts if you really like something. And if you're really having struggles, feel free to private message the Tamaquag Tech. Before we begin, I would like to take a minute to introduce myself and do a land acknowledgement in my language. So you can also acknowledge yourself, say hello in the chat and acknowledge the land you're on. We'll put a guide to land acknowledgements from our belongings blog in there that you might want to look at in your leisure. Or if you want to look at a map, it's not perfect, but it does give you an idea where original native lands were across the nation. Asquequasin, Natasuis Makasini Pashao at Nahai Gansek, Natasuis Lorenz Spears at Englishat, Nin Nahai Gansek Nahantek, Kanupiam at Aki at Nahai Gansek. So, hello everyone. I'm Lorenz Spears. I'm the Executive Director of Tamaquag Museum, and welcome to our program. And my traditional name is Makasini Pashao, and I am Narragansett Niantic, and welcome to the homelands of the Narragansett people. And so I am excited tonight to introduce to you Dr. Patricia Rubertone. Patricia E. Rubertone is a professor of anthropology at Brown University. Her research navigates the intersections of anthropology and anthropological archaeology and history to study indigenous and settler colonial histories, landscape and memory, and issues of representation in Native North America, and especially in the Northeast. She is the author of Grave Undertakings, an archaeology of Roger Williams and the Narragansett Indians from 2001, in which she argues for more complicated and dynamic history of Narragansett cultural persistence from the 17th century to today, and the editor of Archaeologies of Placemaking, Monuments, Memories, and Engagement in North America in 2008. Among her other publications are articles about collaborative archaeology and community histories for strengthening understanding about Native peoples' colonial experiences, their complex relationships with colonialist monuments, and their place in modernity. Her recent book, Native Providence, Memory, Community, and Survivance in the Northeast, was published by the University of Nebraska Press in December of 2020. So we are so excited to have Patricia Rubertone with us today to share about her life, her experience as an author, and this wonderful new book. So hooray, we're so excited to have you here with us, Pat. Welcome, Kanupiam.
Thank you, Loren. It's really an honor to be presenting on my book at the Tamaquag. This is the first public presentation that I've given on the book since it was published in December. So thank you very much. But I want to begin tonight's conversation by offering a land acknowledgement. I'm speaking from Providence, where I live, which is within the traditional ancestral homelands of the Narragansett Nation. The Narragansett people are still very much here and continue to live on the land that this settler colonial city was built upon, as well as in other cities and towns in Rhode Island. They are part of Providence's past, its present, and its future. I also would like to mention that today, Indigenous people from other nations, near and far, reside in this city within the ancestral homelands of the Narragansett and have in former times. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for that lovely land acknowledgement. And, you know, for those, as I stated, our Tamaquag Tech, Haley, she'll be glad to give you the guide to land acknowledgement if your organization is trying to do so. Well, I certainly look forward to sharing more about the book Native Providence and more about your background, Pat, with the audience. Can you share how you became an author and a little bit of your background for us?
Okay, yeah, I'll start. I'm an anthropologist who's trained in archaeology. And in my research, I use written records, material culture, and oral accounts to study Indigenous and settler colonial histories and their relationships. And what really interests me is how these different strands of evidence sometimes overlap and complement each other, and other times diverge. And I think that's the most interesting part, is when they diverge, because that gives us an opportunity to begin to challenge these taken for granted assumptions about European conquest and about vanishing Indians. Now, my research focuses on the Native Northeast. Early on, I worked briefly in New York City's least urbanized borough, where Native occupation predated Indigenous people's urban experiences by thousands of years. But the overwhelming majority of my research in the Native Northeast has been on places of past and continuing Narragansett history. I probably should add that I did my archaeological training in the American Southwest, in the homelands of the Zuni and Hopi people. I did a brief stint in Kodiak, Alaska, among Alutiiq peoples, and I actually did a dissertation in Morocco that was not on Indigenous people. Okay. So I've always been interested in cities. And I think the reason for that is that I was born and raised in one, New York City. Okay. And I've had this abiding and strong interest and strong commitment to trying to understand and study Indigenous past. And in this book, Native Providence, these two interests, came together. They actually came full circle, okay? When I first started teaching at Brown University, I directed excavations at the Roger Williams National Memorial in Providence on North Main Street. It was imagined as a place that was devoid of Native people and their history. Okay. Only later on, as I was researching this book, did I learn that improvements on nearby streets in the early 1800s, okay, uncovered Indigenous ancestral remains, and that Roger Williams, his servant, was a young Native boy who had been taken captive in the Pequot War. Okay. So how did I come to be an author? Well, I have to admit that when I started college, I had this idea of becoming a journalist, but somehow I landed in anthropology. Okay. As a professor, I'm expected to write, and research and writing are the most enjoyable parts of the job. Okay. Though I really like teaching and interacting with students, though I have to admit that there have been real challenges this year trying to teach on Zoom, teaching remotely. Okay. I guess the other point I want to make about writing is that it is isolating, all right? I need my quiet time. I'm not one of those people who could take my laptop, to Starbucks and write. But when I sit down to write, I find myself able to connect the dots. These dots are these pieces of evidence that I've collected from the research that I've done in archives. There are things that I heard in conversations with interlocutors. And there are also things that I've seen, that I've observed. And sometimes they seem absolutely daunting in their scope and the amount of detail. But at the same time, they also seem very sparse and frustratingly ambiguous. Okay. And when you're writing, whether it's an article or a book-length manuscript, there are always some loose ends, okay? Which isn't necessarily a bad thing, because it means there are still other stories to be told.
So you really gave us a very full answer there. Thank you so much. And you kind of already touched on what inspired you to write this book. And you started talking about a little bit about how you did the research, but I'm wondering if you could share a little bit on how you organized the project.
Okay. I was going to, I guess I'll backtrack a little bit here. The more immediate inspiration for this book was research that I had done on monuments that were raised by European Americans in the 19th and early 20th centuries to commemorate Native sachems, most of whom were remembered by European Americans were men, and events of the 17th century. And these monuments contributed to this myth of Native disappearance in southern New England, that basically say that Native people cannot be modern and Indigenous at the same time, okay? But doing this research, I noticed in the programs of dedication and in newspaper reports that Native people sometimes attended the dedication ceremonies. And I wondered why they did that if these monuments said that they existed only in the past. And sometimes they even did the unveilings of these monuments and even said a few words, but mostly they were kept silenced. I wondered, why were they there? I guessed maybe it was to refute these claims, right?
Yes, indeed.
But also to acknowledge the continuing importance of places on the land that were very important in their oral histories that European Americans built their monuments on top of. Okay. So I wanted to know, who these people were, and where they lived. And some are identified by names, in these programs of these dedication exercises. They're mentioned in newspaper articles covering these events. And let me just give you an example. The program for the dedication of the Canonicus monument. It was a large boulder that was inscribed with the sachem's name and his mark and Miantinomo's mark. And it was raised in Providence's North Burial Ground in 1883. And the program indicated that a Narragansett man did the unveiling, and a young Narragansett girl presented a bouquet of flowers to the state-appointed Indian commissioner. And when I did a look, their names were familiar. They resonated with me. And after doing some research, I found out that they lived, not very far from North Burial Ground where this monument was placed. So I began to wonder, if there were two, Native people in Providence, there surely had to be, more, okay? I wanted to know who they were. I wanted to know where they lived, but mostly I wanted to know about their lives, okay? On the understanding, that there never has been a single urban Indian experience, but instead many, right? So I had a bunch of questions, okay? Were these people born in Providence? Did they move there? If they moved there, what routes did they take? Did they travel, once they lived there, did they travel back and forth from the city to the countryside to visit, with, their friends and family? Did they sometimes leave the city when city life became too tough, when there were more disappointments, than opportunities? And what kinds of places did they carve for themselves in Providence within that landscape and fill with all sorts of new memories, right? Mostly I wanted to write about them and because their lives mattered. They mattered to their descendants, but they should also matter to anyone who lives, works, studies, teaches, and visits Providence. All right. All right. So I wanted to do something. There are studies of Native people who live in cities, but mostly they deal with Native people who have lived in cities since about the mid-20th century, after World War II. And they basically, describe Native people as, recent arrivals to the city. They depict them as kind of adrift, unable to cope with urban life, and beset with all kinds of, social problems. But the fact is that Native people have lived in modern cities for a much longer period of time, okay? And like all people who live in cities, they live in smaller patches on that urban landscape. They live within limited stretches of space within neighborhoods, right? And I'm calling these kind of smaller spatial units their urban homelands. All right. So Lauren, what was your question again, since I've gone on here a
No,
bit?
that was wonderful. I was just thinking to myself about how that it's our original homeland. So the urban grows up around our people as well. And that our families lived in that environment for thousands of years, and the urbanization just came afterward. So I think that the question that I was thinking next was around whether there was any particular thing that you were thinking about when you were organizing this book, structurally, like how you were sort of attacking telling the story. Multiple stories.
Yes. The basic scaffolding of the book had to be people, names of people, and where they lived. Okay. And I wanted to tell their story as, I guess I would say, up close and personal. Okay. I took what's called a kind of granular, approach. Right. So yeah, what you're looking at is this map of native Providence. And I'm going to backtrack a little bit because I want to say what went into producing this map. All right. I had to first find names of people before I could research any other kinds, of records. So where did I find those names? One of the things I did initially, which was important in the early part of the research, was reading the 1880 and the 1881 reports on the Narragansett tribe of Indians that are commonly known as the detribalization reports. Okay. Because they contain, names of people and names of family members, ages and towns where people lived. There's also testimony, which transcriptions of testimony given by Narragansett people during public hearings. Okay. This testimony has been filtered. It was directed to some degree, maybe by these white officials who were asking the questions, okay? And it was also filtered through the stenographers who were doing, the note-taking. But what was illuminating about reading these reports is that many Narragansett people lived in places that white officials and other white Rhode Islanders did not expect to see them or find them, okay? I also read Narragansett Dawn. I read all of the issues that came out in 1935 and 1936 and were edited by Prince's Red Wing. I don't know how many of you have seen copies of Narragansett Dawn. I know you have, Loren, but it's wonderful. It's filled with oral histories. It's filled with editorials, language lessons, recipes, and announcements about social events and milestones in Native people's lives, okay? So these are, two sources that were incredibly important in the early stages of my research. And Narragansett Dawn continued to be important in the later stages as well. So at the same time that I was collecting these names, I then turned to other kinds of records, federal and state censuses, records of births, marriages, and deaths, city directories, military records, such as Civil War and World War I draft registration cards, just to name a few. But, you know, if I didn't have these surnames of Native people from the detribalization reports, from Narragansett Dawn, and a few other reports that I looked at, for example, John Milton Earle's 1861 survey of Massachusetts Indians. My work in these other records would have been far less productive. And I always say, instead of writing a 462-page book, I would have written a very, very short story. Right.
So as you're, oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No.
I was just going to say that, you know, you mentioned oral history, but you also were talking about the primary source documents that you were utilizing. And I'm curious to how the oral history, you know, since Indigenous people's history is often rooted in oral tradition, where did that lead you in your research, and how did that lead you along the way?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think I look at Narragansett Dawn as a source of oral histories, you know, that have been, you know, transcribed and put into print. And it was incredibly, you know, informative, you know, snippets, you know, of people's lives, commentaries on how and where people were living in the mid-1930s.
Yes.
And you don't get that richness when you look at a census report. You know, it's a statistical report. It's very terse. I wanted to get beyond that.
And Narragansett Dawn really does that. It really like accentuates what the community is doing. I did pop in the digital version of the Narragansett Dawn. Someone was asking a question if it was a book that was available. I wanted to just express to the audience that it's multiple booklets that were written over a period of time. So there's a volume 1 and a volume 2, and there's quite a few. I don't know. I think there's like 36 or 38, something like that. Editions. And so I put the digital version in the chat for folks.
Great. Yeah, one of the problems that I encountered, and why I say it was so important to have these other sources, the Narragansett Dawn, the detribalization reports, is because Native people were typically called, and I'm going to use the term Indian, as problematic as it is, but they were typically called anything but Indian in some of these other records, like censuses and vital records.
Yes, part of the erasure for certain. I'm wondering if you might share some of your favorite passages and describe why they're important to you, to give people little teasers before they read the book or before they finish, or just to reinforce what they loved or what you loved about the book.
Okay.
And the process of making it.
Let me see what I have here. Okay. What I've thought about is to tell a little bit of these, you know, stories about people's lives that I write about in the book. So I'm going to start by talking about a woman. Her name was Anstress Nichols. Nichols is her marriage name. She lived in Providence's Fox Point. Her mother and grandmother were Narragansett, and so was she. She was widowed in her late 30s with 2 children. Her husband died unexpectedly. And where I'm going to pick up on her story is later in her life. Within the next few years, the home life that Anstress Nichols had tenaciously struggled to preserve in Fox Point would again be shattered when her daughter died. Harriet's death was a profound personal loss, as the death of a child at any age would be to a parent, especially one preceded by the pain and suffering associated with the terminal disease. But there was also another kind of emotional toll that Harriet's death took on Anstress. Her death led to the loss of material things that Harriet brought into their home on Thayer Street that had to be sold to cover the cost of the funeral and other expenses. These things were not merely indices of Harriet's consumption, but they also spoke of her educational opportunities and professional achievements, and in no small way of Anstress's parenting skills. Their sale took away material expressions, not only of the family's social aspirations, but also these women's experiences and the home that had enabled and nurtured them. Having acted in ways that staunchly defied the mutedness of Native women and all women of color in 19th century America, Anstress alone, elderly and in declining health, could no longer maintain and hold on to the home at 5 Thayer Street that had been such an integral part of her identity and survivance. In 1885, she finally left her Fox Point neighborhood, which records suggest she had rarely strayed from for any extended period of time. Another?
Yes, please. That was
Okay.
a powerful story.
This is about Alexander Amos, who also lived in Fox Point. He was a sailor or mariner. He was the son of Gideon Amos, who was a member of the Narragansett Tribal Council in the 1800s. Alexander did not travel. His father was also a very famous whaler. Okay, Alexander did not travel halfway around the world, sail uncharted seas, or share in the excitement and traditions of the chase, the whale chase. Although less sweeping in scope, his life experiences also crossed waters and cultures and were more complicated and cosmopolitan than those generally attributed to Indigenous people. Mostly undocumented by white record keepers, his experiences comment on the struggles to make a space for himself in the city, much like other Native people whose lives were and have remained largely inconspicuous. Whereas Gideon, except for the approximately 2 decades when he was mostly away at sea, was a country person at heart who farmed and did stonework in his later years. Alexander spent more than half of his 37 years in Providence. Ironically, they died in watery places, seemingly worlds apart. Gideon in a Charlestown swamp, and Alexander in the Providence River, not far from his home. Coincidences aside, the differences in their life experiences provide insight into the modes of creative survival in which they, like other Native people, lived within a community that was increasingly diverse and far-flung.
Wow. You know, it shows such a continuity from, you know, the pre-contact, post-contact lifeways of Indigenous people and the intersection of the importance of the water for our people. Does make you wonder how they died, though, since they both died by water. But that's another story for another day, I guess. Did you have one more, or?
Sure. Yeah, I'm going to talk about Clarence Freeman, another resident of Fox Point. He was Pequot. He traveled from Connecticut to Providence, and he was a champion checkers player. All right, and there's a small story about him in Narragansett Dawn. Clarence Freeman lived on Transit Street in Fox Point around the turn of the 20th century, and was a checkers player. It was an occupation that would have befuddled canvassers who logged where people lived and what they did for a living in Providence city directories, as much as it did me, okay? As I searched through documents that listed laborer and teamster as the most common forms of employment for Native men in the 19th and early 20th century New England. For Clarence Freeman, who held a series of jobs after moving to the city from Connecticut while he was in his teens, identifying as a checkers player made him stand out. But it was information that was neither incorrect nor a joke.
Gaming is a tradition.
Yes.
Pre-contact to today, hubbub and moccasin game and all kinds of others.
Mhm.
That's a great story.
Yeah.
Feel free as you're going along, if there's questions that are going along with what she's sharing that you'd like us to reflect on, we're happy to do so as you go. I would like to ask a question around our conversations today around monuments, land back, protests, the actions at the Capitol. How does your work for this book speak to these pressing social issues of the day?
Okay. I have to repeat what I said before. I wanted to write about Native people's lives in 19th and early 20th century Providence because they matter, okay? And to write about them is one way, to remember them. And to be remembered is to be valued, okay? I wrote these words in the introduction to my book before the Black Lives Matter movement peaked last summer and before the events at the US Capitol this past January. Conversations, about public monuments, have intensified. And they usually do at certain historical moments, right? And I think as we've all seen in the news, lately, monuments have been the focus of mass protests. And they've also been the targets of acts of symbolic retaliation because of their associations with colonialism and racism, right? In the Native Northeast and elsewhere, monuments to Indigenous people were a feature of the settler colonialist agenda of eliminating Indigenous people. Okay, I think the same could be said about cities. Cities were the primary technologies of colonial dispossession. This is something that I say, and it's also Carl Thrush, who's written about Indigenous cities on the other side of the continent. He wrote about Seattle, and recently he has a book out on London. The lands that cities are built on, a city like Providence, was appropriated, from Indigenous people. In addition to that, that cities are imagined. Modern cities are imagined, as places that are, without Indigenous bodies, without Indigenous minds, and without Indigenous histories. But the reality is that Indigenous people, remained in Providence or moved to Providence, and continue to be the focus of ongoing processes of elimination. Okay. Some were repeatedly banished in the 18th century, especially unmarried women with children who were propertyless, but they returned again and again. It was almost like yo-yos, right? Others were removed from their homes as the result of urban renewal in the mid-20th century and earlier, because these urban renewal projects disproportionately affected parts of the city where they lived. Those who were too resolute to leave their homes stayed or relocated, to another neighborhood. Toxic hazards were typically, placed in certain neighborhoods, in certain sections of certain neighborhoods. And they perpetrated an environmental genocide, that affected Native people. That was perhaps even more insidious than the paper genocide that we talked about, okay? Despite all of this, Indigenous peoples' urban homelands, what I'm calling their urban homelands, were not terminal landscapes any more than reservations were, okay? They continuously and tenaciously, inscribe themselves into these spaces, the very spaces of their dispossession, and made the modern city, their home. So to the extent that my work is about reclaiming history, I hope that in some small way it does, contribute, to these larger conversations. Questions?
That is really important to reflect on the fact that the impact of you recovering some of these stories to bring to light the indigeneity of the space, the original indigeneity of the space as our homeland, but also the fact that Indigenous people are living in and out of this space the whole entire time of conquest and the creation of this nation and through today. So that's really important. That's a very powerful impact that you were sharing just then. I'm wondering if you had other thoughts about that impact that that might also want to be added, additional thoughts about impacts that you would like your writing to have on the community at large, the Native community, all of us.
Yeah, I want the community at large to know that, yes, and Providence has an Indigenous past that's foundational to its very existence, but it also has a more recent Indigenous history. Regardless how Native people were counted and what they were called in censuses. I said sometimes they were called Indian. They were rarely called or identified by their tribal name. But mostly, they were called, colored, mulatto, sometimes white, sometimes black, and I've even come across the label red, right? Regardless of how they were called in these records, they existed in plain view. Right?
So there's a question in the chat from Nancy asking, how did detribalization impact movement into Providence?
Well, much of the land was sold in return for citizenship. The amount of land that had been set aside in a quitclaim agreement in 1709, had dwindled. There were very limited prospects, for Indigenous people, to farm that land, to eke out a living. Many of them, like other rural folk, they went to cities, to look for jobs, to make better lives for themselves and their families. And some had, been leaving the Charlestown area. They started leaving, before the detribalization was finalized.
And just to reiterate, and people were already living there, so that just added to the numbers of Indigenous people living in the urban environment.
Yeah, I mean, was really interesting in the research is that how family units, even though people moved, right, from the Charlestown area to Providence, there was some semblance of, the family unit that remained intact in the city. Those family units also remained intact if there were stops in between. Okay, so you see members of an extended family, whether it was generational. Sometimes an aunt was living with, her husband and took in, a nephew was living with them. And that was something that, I discovered in my research that, as I said, was very illuminating. The family remained kept intact. People would find each other, right? In addition, to finding, jobs, finding places to live, houses, apartments. Sometimes they owned their own homes. They sent their children to school. They went to churches, they went to powwows, but family units remained intact in the city, but also the families, the people in the city remained part of a much wider and long-standing kinship network.
Thank you. For those that don't know, you can get Dr. Patricia Rubertone's book, Native Providence, in a variety of places, but the Nebraska Press we'll put in the chat. And of course, you can order it from Tamaquag Museum's online store as well, and support Tamaquag Museum. I'm thinking, Patricia, before we open it up to questions from everyone else, I'm wondering if you might share if you have any future goals or projects on the horizon.
Sure. COVID put research on hold because of the closures of different archives and libraries and museums. I was lucky. I was on leave during the fall, and as I was able to do some research, thanks to the kindness of some, curators and librarians, particularly those who could send me digitized collections. But what I'm eager to do next is to pick up on some preliminary research that I did that touches on topics of art, indigeneity, and social and environmental justice. And it really builds on work that I wrote about in my book that focused on Providence's Gorham's Manufacturing Company, right, which was located on Mashpog Pond. And the Gorham Manufacturing Company cast these small bronzes. They were statuettes of much larger statues of Native Americans that were sculpted by an artist named Cyrus Dallin. He was also a non-native member of the Algonquian Indian Council of the 1920s. And the Gorham Company casted, these statues. They were, small enough to put on a table or put on a mantle. And they actively marketed them to white middle-class consumers, while at the same time, they were polluting the pond, with heavy metals, chlorinated solvents, different types of corrosive stripping chemicals, and other, other hazardous materials. And the pond was an important important to Native people, had long been important to Native people who lived around Mashpog Pond and had been living around Mashpog Pond since at least the 17th century. So I'm interested in these connections between marketing these statuettes to white communities. So it was okay to put, quote unquote, an Indian on the mantelpiece, but at the same time, the production of these statuettes and other metals, silverware, and bronzes that Gorham's was manufacturing was polluting the pond, was infiltrating the groundwater, and displacing Indigenous people who called this pondland, their home.
Thank you. That's certainly a project we're very passionate about. I see Holly Ewald out in the audience, who ran UPP Arts and has done just a tremendous amount of work around advocacy for cleaning up Mashpog Pond, and Dawn Dove is out there in the audience as well, and they are both the editors of the book Through Our Eyes, an Indigenous View of Mashpog Pond, which you can get at the Tamaquag Museum. So thank you. We're going to be very excited to hear more about that project as it unfolds. I do want to give some time for people to ask questions. I do see a note from Holly. What you have done in researching and writing this book is so important. Thank you for bringing this to more people's consciousness. And so if other people have questions, you can raise your electronic hand, or you can put it in the chat. There's a thank you from Sylvia Ansors. Thank you, Patricia Rubertone, for this work and in pointing out Narragansett Dawn newsletters by Princess Redwing and Ernest Hazard. I am looking forward to reading it. Thank you to Loren for questions into aspects of the book that reveal the history and Indigenous living in the area. So I'm wondering if you have a question that you'd like to ask Pat directly, feel free to raise your hand. There are 4 pages, so it can be a little bit tricky to navigate that, but I will do my best. If you raise your hand and we don't respond, just jump in.
I guess I just want to say thank you to Holly, and thank you, I missed the other name, for your kind words.
So there's a question from Beth Hansen. It said, did you interview living family members of the individuals? Like descendants?
Yes, that was a part of my methodology that I didn't touch on. But yeah, that was really important. Living Native people shared stories with me. They shared conversations with me. They showed me their family albums. And that was so important to thinking about family, think about family histories, thinking about family values, and learning about the experiences of Indigenous people living in the city, from people who are close to them, and some of them themselves had lived in Providence.
Another question from Aja. How are you? There's so many friends in the audience here. Thank you for your work in this talk, Patricia. Have you ever come across stories on community gardens or Indigenous people living in the city who grew their own food or wanted to cultivate plants?
Interesting question. I don't know about a community garden for the period I was studying, which was, roughly 1850 to about 1930, with a little spillage on either side of, that temporal bracket. But there was a man named, Benjamin Gardner, who actually was a gardener. And he lived on Spring Street in Upper South Providence. And he lived in a house that was a, multi-family, house. I don't know if we would call it a tenement. But in that space between, and it was a fairly, congested, an area that was congested with new buildings, but there was enough space for him to grow a garden. I don't know exactly what he was growing, and I don't know where I could possibly, find that out, other than maybe doing some excavation and retrieving some plant pollen and seeds. Except so it would probably be under a parking lot right now.
Thank you. I see Lily's hand is raised. So I want to go ahead and unmute yourself and ask your question.
Hi, I'm a student from Toronto, Canada. How do you see Indigenous populations and urban communities kind of reconciling, for lack of a better, and also through preservation and archival works? And how do you see museums leading the charge, perhaps, in this sort of
okay. Could you repeat parts of the question?
Yeah, I'm just for reconciliation, how do you see archival and journalism playing a role, and how do museums perhaps lead the way in this?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think as part of museum installations that address aspects of, Native culture and history, there needs to be a movement more toward the present, and not talking about Indigenous people, in the past. And I think, there needs to be conversations of, what shape those exhibitions, those installations, would take, whether they would be object-based, whether they would, be involve, photographs, ongoing, or be somewhere interactive in some ways. So people who go to these exhibits do realize that there are indeed, living Native people, and their cultures and histories are ongoing, and cities are a major, place where Indigenous people today. I don't have the statistics on the top of my head, but I think a significant, portion of Indigenous people today in the United States and elsewhere are urban-based. And that's the part of the story I think that needs to be told.
Yes, indeed. I'm just taking a peek to make sure I'm not missing anybody in the chat for questions. Feel free to pop them in the chat or to raise your hand. There was, let's see, I see Ray has a question, I believe. Hi, Ray.
Hi.
Hi, everybody. I'm
Hi, Ray.
I'm in my PJs, so I'm not on, well, it doesn't matter. I mean, because you can't see my PJs anyway. Well, this is great. I haven't had a chance to read the book yet. I still don't know how to raise my hand in Zoom, and I've been living on Zoom for over a year. I'm just really inspired here, and I'm wondering, and I'm probably voluntolding myself to help with this. Is there an opportunity, you've probably already thought about this, for like a course and like maybe co-teaching like a place-based course where people would like go around Providence and actually explore some of these places and then see the changes over time. And, because as you're well aware, I'm very place-based myself and like love standing at the homestead or like at Narragansett Indian Church and saying, there's so much history and there's people. And so I don't know, just my wheels are turning.
Okay, well, I'm slated to teach a new course in the fall on the archaeology of settler colonialism. But I've also thought, about something dealing with, Providence-based urban experiences. I think it would work, really well as a first year, seminar. That's a good way to introduce, students to Providence and to let them know that it is an Indigenous place, and it still is an Indigenous place. I've also given tours. From time to time, I teach, well, it's called Indians, Colonists, and Africans in New England. This year it had a subtitle, Settler Colonialism and Survivance. But I usually, in non-COVID years, at the end of the class, I take students on a walking tour of the East Side. In past years, we've even ventured out, beyond that.
Great, thank you. We can, it doesn't have to be this fall, but maybe we can talk about that, down the road. Yep. I would to co-teach with you at some point.
So there's another question from Lori. It says, why not make this idea into a museum of the streets? It's certainly the idea of that walking tour certainly coalesces with that nicely, to have that real experience on a place and think about how it's changed over time and the intersection. But any thoughts about how to bring these stories to life?
Yeah, as I said, I give these, walking tours. We visit a few of these houses, but, how could that be, part of, I know there are walking tours of African-American history in Providence. And I think, there should be one on Indigenous histories. And, I don't know really what the mechanisms would be to kind of get that off the ground. Lauren, you're a mover and shaker, so maybe I would leave that to you.
Well, let's collaborate.
Okay.
One of the things that I'd like to see is when they're giving a tour of a certain section of the city, that they intersect all the cultures in that tour, rather than just telling the colonial story or just the African story or just the Native story. tell the story and make that weave through. And that's because I think that's when people would get a full feel of that place and they would stop leaving certain communities out. I mean, you just told an amazing story. It was on Thayer Street. And how many stories do we hear about colonial life in that environment? And here's a Native family living in that space. And you told this story about their lives based off of what you could find, and how many other layers could be found to build out stories, because that's something that we say all the time. We've been here all along. We're in these spaces. It's just that, you know, now there's millions of people living in Rhode Island. And so it makes us a little bit invisible in our own homeland. And that, I think, is something that we all can do. So telling these stories, or as Ella used to say, you know, the truth is the truth is the truth, just waiting to be recovered. And that's what's happening here. When someone was asking, I think it was Lily, about archives and using these stories. Well, your ability to do the research and the digging and to kind of coalesce these stories to make a frame. Obviously, it's not that whole person's story, but it's just enough that we get a feel of the person, their life, their experiences, the intersection between that and the urban lives that we're talking about living in Providence. And I think that that's the recovery part we're talking about. It's undoing that erasure that has happened, that erases us from these landscapes and putting us back into it. And that's what I think the tours should do. As great as it is to have a Native tour that's just specific to that Native story, it's the whole intersectionality of the creation of Providence as a city that were interwoven throughout. So I would love to see that. There's another question in the chat. Are you interested in interviewing other Native people who don't appear in your book?
Well, I worked on the research for this book. I've been involved in this project for 10 years. And there's an appendix. You know, there are some people, each of these homelands that I talked about, you know, Fox Point, Lippet Hill, Upper South Providence, Lower South Providence, Mashpog Pond, Federal Hill, and even touched a little bit on Johnston. Within these homelands, I told the stories of people that I had researched. I found out more, I learned more about some of them than others. You know, that's the nature of the archive, okay? But those that I couldn't say that much about, plus those that I could say more about, are listed in an appendix at the back of the book. And there are about 350 names in that appendix, as well as I identify the urban homelands where they lived while they were in Providence. So what I'm thinking, you know, that appendix is a useful document. You know, I hope that particularly members of the Native community find that useful, because it might spark, you know, conversations about these other people, to flesh out their lives a little bit more. It might expand on that map that was on the screen about a half hour ago. All right. So yes, as I said, the book yes, it's published. 10 years of my life went into it, at least. But there are more stories to tell. And, you know, whether there's a sequel to this book or not, I don't know. But there might be, you know, other formats to consider. You know, we talked about the walking tour. There's also the possibility of doing, you know, story maps that are, you know, more accessible.
Fantastic. Well, now we all have our job to do to read the appendix as well as the whole book and really get these stories down. Thank you so much Dr. Patricia Rubertone for joining us this evening and sharing all your insights during this author conversation. I see lots of virtual and hand clapping. I have just a few announcements before you go. I just wanted to let people know that our next session of Literature and Culture Author Conversations is June 9th with Christine DeLucia, Memory Lands. And later in June, we also have Lisa Brooks for Our Beloved Kin, all of which you can find on our events page on our website. You can see past author conversations on our YouTube page. Be sure, if you love books, I imagine we're all here, we love books. On Tuesday evening, Silver Moon LaRose, our assistant director, is leading our Indigenous Authors Book Club. They're currently reading Green Grass, Running Water by Thomas King, and soon to be reading Gardens in the Dunes by Leslie Marmon Silko. So join them on Tuesday nights. If you want to have some fun with me in the kitchen, I'm doing a project for Hope's Harvest, Rhode Island on May 13th, where we're going to be making succotash, and I'm going to be doing a demonstration on how to make it and doing lots of talk about food and fun in the kitchen. So come join us for that. You can find all of these on our website at tamaqua.museum.org/events. We also partner with We Are the Seeds, and they are, every month we're doing an art workshop, and that's coming up on May 22nd. I'm not quite sure who the artist is this month. I forgot to write that down, but we'll have that as soon as they give us the new flyer. We'll post it on our website as well. I just want to thank our funders again, because without them, particularly in this last 14 months, we all needed our funders very greatly. And I want to thank the Rhode Island Council for the Arts, the Rhode Island Council for the Humanities, USDA Rural Development, and the New England Foundation for the Arts, and all our generous donors. We continue to be booking virtual programs, but we are in the midst of figuring out how we're going to reopen in June for some on-site tours and programs. And so I hope you'll join us here at Tamaqua Museum over the summer. And I'm giving you a little way out in the way ahead tip. In the fall, we're going to be having a specially traveling exhibit called Away from Home, the American Indian Boarding School, and it will be happening at the University of Rhode Island. We've done all our legal agreements to use their space for this 2,000 square foot plus exhibit, talking about the boarding school experience. So we're really excited to have that coming this fall. And we're also partnered with Brown and the John Nicholas Brown Center for the Public Humanities, the Humanities Action Lab, and the exhibit Climates of Inequality is coming to Providence, and you will be able to see that in November, December as well. So we've got a lot happening this year. So keep your eyes posted for when those go live on our websites as well. Join me again in thanking Dr. Patricia Rubertone for this fantastic author conversation, and have a wonderful night. Wuni Nakan.
And thank you, everyone. I haven't seen familiar faces, but I've seen familiar names coming across the screen.
The question is,
thank you so much.
Online, it will. It takes us a couple of weeks, but eventually it'll get on our YouTube page. So yes, it will follow up online. Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for joining us this evening. All our friends and relatives. Thank you so much. Oh, I see Dr. Maria Lawrence. She was one of our past board co-chairs. I just noticed her name just then. So nice to see everybody. Our friends at URI and Brown and Bryant. All kinds of, Roger Williams National Memorial. I see all kinds of folks here. Thank you all for joining us this evening. We so appreciate it. There's lots of thanks in the chat for you. And thank you, Donna, for being here again. She's been steadfast on every single one of our author conversations. Thank you so much. And thanks for promoting it as well. Thank you, thank you, thank you, everyone. Have a great night.